really happy that you'll be on a panel, trying to get a couple of other people that I think would be great. And do you know the Brickle Group up in Woonsocket?
No, I think you had asked me that last time, and I'm not
Yeah.
familiar with them. No,
Yeah, they're
unfortunately.
still in business, which is amazing. But they do a variety, they're diversified, they do a variety of products. So
Where do they operate out of?
Woonsocket. And
Osaka,
they
really?
also own some other mills around the area. I'm not exactly
I
sure.
can remember when I worked at Quaker, we had a dye house in Woonsocket,
Hmm.
and that was the day in the day before the EPA used to get heavily regulated. And sometimes I'd go by, and the Blackstone River was green. Other days it was purple. Other days it was red.
Yep.
I was amazed that they got away with it for as long as they did. Once they had a union, once they went on strike, the mill owner of Quaker just shut it down, and we sent all of our dyeing down south to be done at a place called Printed Fabrics in Carrollton, Georgia. That was
So
my first real exposure to Southern hospitality and the unfortunate remnants of racism that were still in the deep South.
mm,
I'd
yeah,
never seen that.
yeah. Tell me about that a little.
Well, I can remember the first time I went. What happened was we used to do flocked velvets, and we had a woven nylon fabric called Nova that we used to print on. It was the old kind of wagon wheels and uh, waterfall scenes with barns on them. And we started to get a lot of complaints from customers regarding seconds. So my job was to go down every month and check all of their production before they'd ship it out because they were basically inspecting their own dyeing process, and they let a lot of stuff out that they shouldn't have. I can remember that going down there, the first thing that struck me was it was an old mill building by the side of a river, and I saw these three big blocks. There was one in the center, one that was low, about a foot off the ground, and the other was about 2 feet off the ground. Maybe it was 3 feet up. And I asked the plant manager what that was for. He says, "Oh, that's where they used to trade the slaves. They put the father up on the top, the mother on the left, and whatever children were to the right." And I said, "Don't you think that should be taken out?" He said, "Yeah, that does nobody pays attention to it." And it was just the whole way they talked to them. I remember him introducing me to these two, at the time, middle-aged black men. And he said, "This is James, and that is Charles. And you are not to lift a single roll. They'll lift the rolls for you, put them on the inspection table. You inspect it, and they'll put them away." So after a couple of days, I just started talking to these guys, and I said, "James," I said, "how long have you been here?" And he said, 14 years. I said, and I was watching, coming from a mill up here, I would look at all the other jobs that were available. And I say, "Don't you have enough seniority where you could maybe elevate yourself to a forklift operator or something like that?" He said, "Just matter of fact." He said, "No, that's a white man's job." And I said, "What? A white man's job?" I was just floored by it. And I remember I wanted to go into Atlanta one night, and the plant manager told me I should be careful where I went because it used to be a nice town until he used the N word, until the N people screwed it up. And he said this right in front of them,
Yeah,
right in front of them at the inspection table.
yeah, yeah.
Kind of shocking. Anyway, that was that incident, and we got the quality under control, and that was just one of the aspects of my job before I went into sales.
Mm.
Just doing a lot of, I was a loom inspector, making sure the looms were set up right. You'd have to match the pattern on the loom to the swatch, make sure all the ends and the warp were correct, make sure they had the right filling yarns in. And I think 14 years working in the mill gave me a pretty solid foundation for being in sales because at that stage of my career, there literally was not a job, a question that a customer could ask me that I could not answer.
Mm.
If they asked me anything technical about the fabric, whether it was how many ounces of latex per yard were on the back, the pick level, the sleigh count. We had a 9216 ends was our top end, and then we went 4608, and then 2304 was the lowest end warp count that we had, and that was for basically fabrics that were like $3, $4 per yard. They were all jacquards mainly that we wove. We wove a few planes. Interesting fact, Quaker fabric, before it was called Quaker fabric, was called Providence Pile. And they had tufting machines that used to make carpeting. And their claim to fame was that they had made the carpeting for the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty inside, which I always thought was funny. And being in textiles was interesting. Aspect of it was also that beyond weaving, they also made their own yarns. So we had a yarn sales division called Nortex International. And I can remember going out to, it was in Pennsylvania. It was Pennsylvania House, furniture manufacturer. And in those days, we'd have these big hard cases with wheels on them, and you'd fold your fabrics in there. And I can remember one of the sales reps, because we'd all kind of do the rounds at the same time. He'd said to me, he was from Culp, I think. No, he was from Sunbury Mills.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And he said, where's your next call? I said, at Sunbury. He said, how can you be going to Sunbury? You sell fabric for Quaker. I said, well, we have a yarn sales division. Yeah. So it was a unique opportunity because I get to see kind of both ends of the spectrum in terms of selling yarns to designers. Mm-hmm. And some places would let me in the design studio. Others, like Culp, would not. Yeah. I'd have to meet in a kind of an outside meeting room and show them the yarns there. But it was a real interesting. My whole career it was in textile, so it was interesting from the start right to the end. It was great, and the best part was the people, of course. Yeah. Meeting with the people, because your customers really are not like customers in the sense of like being a car salesman or an insurance salesman. You see the same customers usually 4 times a year. Mm. We'd see them at showtime in December and July, and then in between, the bigger accounts would come up to the mill, like Cravat, and they would preview the line. They would buy the items that they wanted on site so that they could have exclusivity to those patterns. Mm-hmm. And then there were little accounts. I remember having one little account in the Bronx called Precision Dinette. And they made these, if you can remember the old dinette sets that were made out of wrought iron. And they might have had a glass table, and the seats, the little round section was the part that used our upholstery. And I can remember the gentleman that owned it, his name was Tony Napolitano. And he told me never to come after 3:00. And I asked him why. He said, well, that's when all the kids get out of school. And if they see any cases in your car, you got to remember, this is the Bronx. They're going to break into your car and they'll steal your cases. And sure enough, one day I got out of Manhattan and I said, I got one last call. I think I can squeeze Tony in. And I got there. It was like 5 of 3. And I showed Tony the line. And I said, where's your brother? He says, he's not here today. He says, I fired him. He's pumping gas in Jersey. I said, what? His way of joking, of course. He was friends with Chaz Palmero, the actor. They went to school together, and he had a big autograph sign. Anyway, I got back to my car, and sure enough, the back window was broken, and one of my cases was gone. So I went back into Tony, and the minute he saw me return, he said, someone broke into your car, right? I said, yeah. He says, drive down the block about 3-4 blocks. And he says, you'll probably find the cases once they see that there's nothing but fabric in there. He said, they'll just dump it. And sure enough, he was right. I found my cases, put them back together, got in the car and drove home. And in those days, I would leave on a Monday morning at about 6 o'clock so I could be in Manhattan for 10:30. I'd do my calls and get back usually Thursday night about 10 o'clock, go into the office on Friday, set up my appointments for the following week, and then do it all over again in just a different part of the country, different part of the Northeast territory. And I did that for, I think, 14 years. So it was, no, a little bit longer. But once Quaker closed, I got a call from Valdez asking me if I wanted to go down to work for them, but I would have had to have relocated. And I liked the South, but it was just not a place for me and my family to live. I enjoy New England. So I decided to stay here, and I got a call from actually one of my customers, whose name was Herb Kahn, and he was the owner of Regal Fabrics. And he offered me a job. And I took it, and I finished off my career there. Yeah. So that was one of the aspects. And of course, working with the designers was a real great treat for me, because in the beginning, Quaker never really catered to the jobber trade. They only sold to furniture manufacturers because the mill essentially was based on large volume runs. And it wasn't until we got a fella who was, he had come to us from Stevens Linen, which was in Webster, Mass. His name was Rocco Simone. He went on to become part owner in Sunbury. He came in and started a jobber program. And it was great for me to see these beautiful fabrics. We had never woven anything over $7 or $8 a yard. And we saw these beautiful fabrics coming out, and he took me around to the different jobbers. And of course, as you know, when you sell a jobber, you have to offer them 3 years minimum of continuity. Some want 5. And the mill was a bit reticent in the initial phases of entering the jobber market, because being a volume-based mill, once anything fell below 1,000 yards, it really wasn't anything that they wanted to entertain. This stuff of weaving 1 or 2 pieces for a customer was not their gig at all. But we ended up getting a new vice president of merchandising, whose name was Tom Musicari, and he really came from the jobber world. He worked previously with Milliken and Collins and Aikman. And he used to go along with me to the jobs to kind of ensure the fact in their minds that Quaker would be committed to the jobber industry. And to demonstrate our commitment to the jobber industry, he made sure that every time I went to a customer, I was accompanied by a designer. So people like Paula Becker, Kristen Crane, Nancy Machado. There were lots of designers that we'd alternate, but they take turns, and it was interesting to see the dynamic that would occur between the designers, myself, and the designers who worked at the jobbers like Kravet, United Fabrics, Robert Allen, which of course was a very big jobber at the time. And that's how we were able to successfully build the jobber industry at that time into just in the Northeast, it was close to $10 million. And then we started to go out further, and we got to Fabric Cut out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was just a great industry and a great learning experience for me. It really was.
So 2 things, but one thing I would like is if you could just quickly tell, I think you mentioned the last time we talked that you started at SMU, and what you went for. And then the other thing is to sort of talk about the heyday, like getting into the industry, the heyday, and then when it started to, go away.
So what is it about UMass that you want to know?
Well, didn't you say you majored in like textile chemistry or something?
No, they had three. They had three textile courses that you could major in: textile design, textile chemistry, and textile technology.
Mm.
And because I didn't work in a lab and I wasn't just the chemistry thing never excited me. I thought, well, I've already got all this knowledge about looms and weaving. I'll take the textile technology. And at the time, I was working second shift, so I would take my courses during the day and go to work from 3 to 11 at night.
Where were you working?
At Quaker Fabric in Fall River.
You went to school after you started at Quaker?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you went before.
At the same time. I was 1971, I started, and about a year later, it was a year later, I went, and I was at Bristol Community College just taking, what do they call it, liberal arts courses. And after the first year, I said, this is not so exciting. I should really get into something that will help me further my career. So then I started taking my courses in textile technology. And I had a guy by the name of Professor Ritz, who was very good. And I remember him telling me, he said, how many years have you worked in the mill? I said, about 2 or 3 years now. He says, oh, this is going to be a breeze for you. It was kind of funny because everything that, he was teaching us, I kind of really already had experienced. And I remember him asking me if I could give my class a mill tour. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to give him a mill tour. So I arranged it with the plant manager. And I remember my fellow students coming through, and I took them through every phase of, because we had our own cotton spinning division and our own Tasland, air texturing. I took them through the bales of cotton being opened, being blended, being spun into roving, and then being spun into novelty yarns, some with slubs, and then showed them the warping process and the weaving process and the back coating process. And I remember one of my fellow students said to me, wow, you've got it made. You're already in the industry. I said, yeah, it's true. But I said, you got to go to school during the day and work from 3 to 11 at night. It's not so easy as you think. But anyway, that was what I did. And then eventually, I always took an interest in reading the trade magazines, Furniture Today. I always liked going into the sales department and design rooms to see what they were working on. That was the beauty about working in quality control. You got exposed to all of the different facets of manufacturing within that huge mill, which in its heyday, I think employed 1,400 people. It was Fall River's largest employer at the time. Yeah. So one day I got a call, and it was the vice president of sales, Tom Finneran. He said, one of the designers told me, her name was Sheila Emity at the time, that you're interested in sales. I said, yeah. I always thought sales was the most fascinating part of textiles. He said, well, why don't you come in and we'll talk? And we did. And he said, go home, talk it over with your wife, think about it, because it's going to be a big change for you. He said, I only live 3 miles from the plant. I literally could walk there if I wanted to. He said, you're going to be covering 11 states. I said, really? He said, yeah, it's all of New England, New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. That was my territory. That was the Northeast. And I can remember there was this guy at the time, his name was Elliot Morris, who sadly has since passed. He had the Northeast, but he had worked out a deal with the owner of Quaker Fabric to put him on salary with all his expenses paid, because he had gone through a very bitter divorce. And if his car was paid for by the company, the gas and all that, it was kind of hidden as an expense, so he wouldn't have to split it with his ex-wife. And his father, his father-in-law had owned a woven tie mill in Pennsylvania called Fortinsky Fabrics, Fortune Fabrics.
Mhm.
The owner's name was Bob Fertinsky. And when Elliot got a divorce, unfortunately, Bob hired the Johnny Cochran of divorce lawyers. And it, it was unfortunate. So I said, I found it odd that Tom would offer me this job, and Elliot already had the job. So I went to see Elliot the day before I made my decision. And I said, Elliot, why aren't you staying on? He said, well, he says, if you want to knock yourself out to make $50,000 a year and cover 11 states in the middle of the winter, you can have it. Knock yourself out, kid. And I thought, well, in 1980, that was a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said, son, I guess he's spoiled. I don't know. I said, all right, I'll try it. And I took it with the guarantee from the mill owner, Alan Simons, that if I couldn't make the adjustment, I could always come back and work in the mill. And he agreed to that. And it worked out so that when I met Rocco Simone, who came from Stevens Linen, he told me, kid, he said, I'm going to tell you how it works. The first year, you don't even know what you don't know. He said, your second year will be even more shocking because then you're going to realize what it is that you don't know. And it's going to scare the heck out of you. And he said, the third year is when everything starts to make traction. All of the connections you've made, the appointments you've made, your knowledge of the fabrics, everything will start to fall into place. And sure enough, he was right.
Yeah.
He was right, because I was ready to quit after the first year. And I remember calling Rocco at home, and he was off on another trip. And I spoke to his wife, and I said, Peggy, I think this is not for me. She says, how long have you been doing it? I said, 11 months. And I was at a place in Pennsylvania where there was a company called Nelson Furniture. They made middle to low end furniture. And it was just one of those trips where I left on a Monday. I didn't feel well. By Tuesday, I was really sick. And by Wednesday, I had the flu. And I could do nothing but wait to get back to the hotel and just sit in the tub and soak. And I called her, and she said, you have to give it at least another 6 months, because you'll regret it if you don't see your way through. And to her credit, I stayed the extra 6 months, and then that's when things started to change. And, the accounts started to realize that I wasn't just there as, it just worked out. It just worked out.
Yeah.
So that's the part from UMass to sales.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the second part that you wanted to talk about?
Well, I just thought, because you entered the industry around 1980 or mid 70s.
In sales?
No,
I started in the mill in 71.
Yeah. So like the rise and the fall, so there was a heyday, when we were all traveling and getting, first class hotels and all of that. And then
absolutely. Yeah. That was, I would say that started in the 80s. In the 80s was really the peak, all the way through the 90s. And when 2000 came and we had 9/11, things started to change. I can remember being at Decasset in Brussels when the planes hit the towers. And one of my Russian customers told me, he said, this industry is never going to be the same. And he was right. I mean, we used to have some of our Arab customers come in, and they would order one, sometimes two containers, 2 40-foot containers of fabric on the spot. And then that gradually started to change. And, but in its heyday, it was almost like we went from being a mill that would quote customers 6 weeks to quoting them 16 weeks. That's how busy we were. And they were giving employees a $500 bonus if they could get someone to come in to work in the mill. And last 3 months, they'd get a $500 bonus, but they had to sign a waiver that said it was mandatory to work 6 days. And it was not uncommon for many of these workers in the mill. A lot of them came from Portugal, the Azores specifically, they would work 60, 70 hours a week. And many, not for lack of trying, but just because of the economic conditions, they came here with no formal education. Mm-hmm. And here they were in the 80s, they were making 50, 60,000 bucks a year with their overtime. That's money that was unheard of for any mill worker.
Yep.
You know, but it happened. And in sales, the commissions were, it depended what mill you worked for, but at Quaker, it was a 2.5% commission, which didn't sound like a lot, but it ended up being a lot because if you look at the numbers, in the early days, I once asked one of our senior salesmen, Howie Rosenberg, how the commission rates were structured. He said, Gil, you've got to remember that when the mills really started kicking in the 50s and sales were done on the road, it was hard to get a person to leave his family and be gone weeks at a time, sometimes, or a week at a time. So they had to pay them well. So this commission structure was based on the fact that a typical salesman would earn a pay that would be close to double what the average person made in the mill. But it was based on fabrics that in the 60s were selling for $2 and $3 a yard. Now we enter into the 80s, we're selling fabrics for $8, $9, $10 a yard. So the dollars and pennies and cents ended up accumulating pretty quickly, and it was providing many sales reps with a good living. I can remember there were several down south, whereas, you know, if you were in High Point, that was like the capital of the industry, and there were salesmen that never had to spend an overnight in a hotel, and they were making $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a year. It was unbelievable. One of them on the Rolls Royce, he would literally get in his car and go to see customers in his Rolls Royce.
When was this? What years were this?
This was in the late 70s, early 80s.
So it was booming and business was good. And so just, you know, when did you begin to see the change?
I think it was, let me see. It was probably I would say 96, 97. If you recall, during our last conversation, I was at Showtime showing the line, and this Asian gentleman came in to my showroom and he said, "Can I look at your line?" And I said, "Sure." And I began showing him the line, and then he opened up a case and he started showing me his fabrics, and it was a bunch of tapestries with like Disney figures on them, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, all these things. And I said, you know, you have to have those copyrighted. And he didn't seem to know about that. But in any event, as every subsequent Showtime would come by, we would see more and more of these Asian mills starting to display in what was then called the temporary exhibitions portion of Showtime, which was in the old Thomasville plant in High Point. All of the major mills, of course, Mastercraft, Quaker, Sunbury, they were in the main building, but the Chinese were they were kind of allocated to the temporary spots. And you could just see when you looked at the fabrics, initially they were very, very rudimentary designs, very basic. Not the colors were way off from what they should have been, based on our understanding of the way patterns and colors work. But eventually, as time went on, they got better and better and better at it. The quality got better first, and then the designs and the colors got better. And it got to the point where when Quaker closed in 2007, and I went to work for Regal Fabrics, Regal initially started bringing in all of their fabrics from Italy and Belgium, because that was kind of like the secondary source. If you weren't buying from an American mill and you wanted to buy real good quality, other than mills like Sunbury and Scalamandre, you went to go to mills in Italy like Mario Sartori. There were mills in Belgium, one that we also repped. The name escapes me now. There were so many of them. Oh, Belliot Fabrics in Belgium. And even the European mills, they had a unique take on it. The European mills tended to focus on their own homeland designs, and they were more traditional in design, not so much contemporary. And they were happy. The Italian mills were just happy to cater to the Italian market, or the European market per se. Anything they got beyond that was pure gravy to them. But the Chinese were ferocious competitors. And they really, it was just astonishing. We had this one gentleman that used to come in. He'd show the line to us at Regal. And then, of course, our designers would take that line and tweak it. We could do our own designs. And, of course, with the advent of CAD and them being able to design patterns and then just send them the discs, that's really what began the decline of manufacturing, in my estimation, of woven goods in this country, and the fact that the Chinese were not only aggressive, but they took full advantage of taking the money that they had, much of which was all government subsidized, and pouring it into high-end equipment. There were Dornier looms. The first time I went to China, I was shocked to see these looms that cost well over $100,000 a piece. And they were fully vertical too. They would not only weave, but they would also make the pillows there. They would make bedspreads in the same building. So that eliminated, beyond the woven aspect of it here, that eliminated people. Like, I had a lot of pillow manufacturers, chair pad manufacturers, top of the bed. That all went to China, and it all went so quickly. I think I told you that story once about the gentleman, after having gotten to know him. He said, I can't believe, this was over dinner once. We were in Shanghai. He said, I can't believe it's like you handed us your industry on a silver platter. And of course, a lot of it was because of NAFTA, and the textile industry was never heavily regulated. If you look back to 1917, there were tariffs back then to keep European mills from selling into the States, so that we could build what was the beginning of a textile industry in this country. And I would say today, the Chinese manufacturers, they must hold at least 50% of the woven market, if not more,
in the world,
for upholstery. And in apparel, as you know, it was even quicker.
Oh yeah.
Quicker. I was shocked, because I did have a few apparel accounts in Manhattan. Some that made, we had a company that made these beautiful women's jackets out of tapestries that we would sell them. And that went away too. Well, I'll tell you what, Deborah, I remember going to Russia, because we had a large distributor there called Allegro Master. And I was having dinner once. We would have dinner. I would go to their furniture markets twice a year. And one day I was watching one of the import managers from Allegro Master having a conversation, and there was a Chinese gentleman at the end of the table. So he was speaking English, Russian, and Mandarin, all at the same time. And I said to him, I said, Yuri, what's going to happen? He said, Gil, the handwriting's on the wall. He said, we share a border with China, number one. And then I remember him, because he was involved in lots of different industries. He was just one of these entrepreneurial geniuses that could make money at whatever he decided to do. He picked up a salt shaker off the table, and he said, look, if I make the salt shaker in the United States, it costs me 18 cents. Okay. If I take the same salt shaker and I have it made in China, it cost me 4 cents.
Mm.
No, he says, if you're in my shoes, where are you going to have that made?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that it was a simplistic comparison to make, an analogy to make, but it was so true.
Mm.
That's what drove it all. It was just they could make far more profit on the same product, and it was just a matter of economics. And if you went to China, you could see these people working. It was astonishing. Everybody was working. I saw people in garages spraying lacquer on furniture at 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our designers would want a design change. They'd call us in China. We'd give them the instructions. They'd say, "Come back tomorrow. We'll have the fabric woven, and you can evaluate it."
Yeah. Mm.
I mean, you can't fault them for their work ethic. If anything, I think it was greed on the part of some of the big players, because there was just far more profit to be made with almost no risk to them on their part. And
yeah. Question. So I know that the US stopped investing in new technology and they were not keeping up with places like China. Why do you think that? Why do you think that we didn't? Was it because we weren't government funded?
Here's my take on it, and I could be wrong. The last manufacturer of looms in this country was actually, I think, in Worcester, Mass. It was the Draper Loom Company.
Yeah.
And the last loom they made came out of that factory in the 60s. One of the biggest things, unlike other industries like the pharmaceutical industry or the automotive industry, there were not any major players with deep enough pockets to go to Congress, go down to the Senate. The president of Quaker Fabric was on the United States Chamber of Commerce. And he came back one day and basically said they don't care about the textile industry because there wasn't the money to pay lobbyists to support these. I think the only aspect of the furniture, the textile industry that may still be intact in this country, and I could be wrong, is the carpet industry, wall-to-wall carpeting. And if you think about it, it's like that because who uses and manufactures the yarns? DuPont, Monsanto.
Yeah.
They have pretty deep pockets.
Yeah. Well, Textron and DuPont bought up their conglomerate. Like they started back in the 50s buying up half of New England, all of the New England mills and then bringing them to the South. And yeah, there are a lot of mistakes made. This has been great. I know you have to go.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah. Yeah.